Hello everyone, I have some good news. I finally launched my new Skillshare class that has been in the works since the beginning of this year. It's called Embracing Tracing, Transferring Reference Images for Watercolor, and it was created in response to all the questions I get in my classes and tutorials about how to transfer the reference images that I use. The class starts with discussions on using reference and the stigma of tracing, branches into multiple methods for transferring images, and we even take a look at some more complex subjects and talk about what information is really needed to transfer and what we can leave out. If you'd like to check out that class and support the many months that it took to produce, there is a link in the description in this video, and I would be tremendously grateful. Today's video is a companion piece to that class, talking about related concepts but with unique footage that is not found in that class. With that, let's get started on our main topic for today, drawing and painting, and how they are two entirely different skills. Both are very important skills for creating realistic artwork, but recognizing which area that we ourselves are struggling with can make us better equipped to practice the skills that help us to grow as artists. So let's learn how to identify each. First, let's take a look at this sketch. It's okay, all the right pieces are there, but when we compare it to an accurately traced image, we can start to see many inaccuracies. The forehead is too small, the ear is too big, the front of the face is too big, the overall head is too big. The length of the trunk and the legs are among some of the only things that are drawn properly. Now let's take a look at a couple of paintings. This first painting uses an accurately traced image, but there wasn't much care in placing the watercolors themselves. There are some moments where those loose washes have a really lovely quality to them, and I particularly like the soft transition in the middle of the ear and the harsher shadow on the elephant's temple. However, rushed techniques caused a lot of issues, which we'll cover throughout this video. This painting captures the overall gist of what we were going for, but if I was going for realism, it was far too rushed, which we can see if we compare it to a painting using the same sketch that was more carefully executed. I do want to stress that preferring the free-form style of the first painting more than the more controlled look of the second is entirely valid, but for the sake of this video, we are considering the overall techniques needed to paint a realistic subject. So now that we know what we're looking for, let's take a look at the process of painting two different pieces. We are going to start painting the rushed inaccurate sketch, which I will label painting 1 in the upper left-hand corner. Despite the sketch being inaccurate, I'm going to attempt to paint it with as much care and respect as I can lend. My preferred way of painting most subjects is to use a wet on dry technique, meaning I place wet paint on dry paper with my paintbrush. Then either cleaning off this brush or using a second brush with clean water, I will soften off some of the edges so that I can have the most control over where each of these little washes goes. This allows me to have some hard edges where I want them, which I wouldn't be able to achieve with wet on wet, while it still allows me to create those loose, lovely washes that watercolor is known for. Next, we have painting 2, which is the accurately traced drawing that we will be painting rather hastily. As a quick little note, I wanted to keep the footage as side by side as possible, so for now, ignore the bottom portion of this painting as we'll come back to it in a bit. In this version of the painting, I'm applying a much larger wet wash to the area first. Then, once most of the surface is wet, I drop in some extra pigment. The paint is going to have more room to flow right away, and I will have less control over where it goes. And that's it! That's the whole first layer of the second ear, so let's go back to painting 1. As I move into the face, I am taking care not to add too much water next to the ear that is still damp, which would cause back runs. Once that area is established, I can work my way across the face. In this first layer, I am primarily aiming to establish a value. You'll continue to see me use wet on dry technique when softening off the edges, but you'll also see me using a mostly dry brush to soak up water from time to time that I'm not happy with the placement of. This helps me to preserve my highlights where I need them. As we head back over to painting 2, we pick up right where we left off, continuing with a large wash from the ear over to the forehead and face. We place what ends up being a pretty uniform, flat wash throughout. As we work our way down the trunk in painting 1, I take care to preserve small highlights in the wrinkles of the skin by placing those little washes and softening off the edges. There is some wet on wet when we move to adjacent areas, but overall my paper isn't sopping wet and the paint won't travel very far. We don't go back to the upper part of the trunk until the paper is sufficiently dry so that we won't cause backruns by placing wet paint on damp paper. This is also a good time to mention another Skillshare class of mine on mastering water control. If you are a beginner and some of these descriptions that I'm giving are moving a little bit too fast for you, I have a very detailed class starting at the beginning and working our way up to this level. The class project is even a rhinoceros with a similar skin texture, so if you like this painting, you should enjoy that one as well. I highly recommend checking it out. Back on painting 2, I have not waited for the upper portion of the head to dry. I have skipped down to the bottom of the trunk and am moving upwards to meet the other wet wash. No details or preserving highlights seen here. Now it's time for the body of painting 1. There are a lot of dark shadows underneath the legs and head of this reference photo. Instead of painting strictly light to dark in this first layer, we're going to try and place some of those shadows right off the bat. And here is a related tip. When you are mixing a dark color on your palette and your brush is loaded with all that pigment, instead of rinsing it off and going directly to a lighter area of the painting with less pigment, if you can, find a shadow to place those first few strokes in, and that way you won't have to waste any of your paint. We can also drop more pigment into the darker areas if we need to while the paint is still wet. Here I am painting wet on wet, but the paint in my brush is highly concentrated with very little water. This helps it not to spread out as much when it touches the wet wash. It will still soften off, but we will be able to see those strokes better. This can help us to create that wrinkled texture that is not part of the focal area of the painting and therefore is not as sharp. Now we're rolling back that footage on painting 2 as promised so that you can see the first wash of the body. I'm going right in with juicy washes with a moderate amount of pigment. I will be dropping some more pigment into the darker areas, but otherwise I'm just trying to cover the area as quickly as I can, expecting to paint the details in a future layer. Now that the entire first layer is down on both paintings, it's time to start applying the details. In painting 1, I'm starting with the focal area of the painting, which is the face. I'm still using the same size brush, a size 8 round silver black velvet. These brushes come to very fine points, so I really only need the one size and only need to downsize if I want to work in really tiny little areas such as fine hairs. Here I am making some value adjustments to shape the contour of the face. Using the side of the brush instead of the point, I can place a wider area of paint without overworking the wrinkles that I've already placed. If you do this with a stiffer or smaller brush, you will risk the layers lifting from underneath. Here we are back to the fine tip of the brush for the smaller wrinkles around the eye and later the trunk. You can probably already guess what I'm going to say about the technique though. Wet on dry, then soften off the edges, albeit a bit more carefully for these little tiny wrinkles. Throughout this painting, I have been using my favorite gray mixture made with cerulean blue and Indian red. And I am very excited to let you know that I am officially working on releasing Denise's Gray with Da Vinci Paint Co. It is not ready yet, but I did get the go-ahead to let you all know that it is coming soon. I promise to share more details once it's ready. Painting 2 is going to look a lot different in this phase. I started off by moving quickly with some outlines of the wrinkles of the ears and haphazardously softening off just a couple of them. Moving to the face, I am putting down too much pigment and trying to soften off with too much water, making for very confused looking wrinkles. As a viewer, and with the context of the full painting, we get the idea of what they're supposed to be, but it wasn't handled very well. I got really lazy for the trunk, setting a half-hearted shadow on one side and then doing like these straight lines extending across the trunk for the wrinkles. Another thing I want you to notice is the time between laying down the initial paint stroke and then going back to soften them off with water. In painting 2, I do a few lines at a time, making sure to revisit them before they start to dry. In painting 2, I'm doing the larger areas of wrinkles before trying to soften them off, which is causing back runs in some areas and untouched hard edges in others. We are just a smidge out of order here, but back in painting 1, we are revisiting the ear, which I didn't do before I did the second layer on the face. Here, the wrinkles aren't as prominent, but there are large folds that I am trying to be careful with so that they look like large flapping elephant ears. I need to look closely at the reference for which areas are shadowed and which areas are highlighted. Moving on to the body, still on painting 1, it's going to be more of the same. We already have a good value map down thanks to our work in the first layer, so this layer can focus on the finer details and darkening only the deepest of the shadows. I'm taking particular care with the wrinkles that we can see in the lower part of the legs. The direction is neither horizontal or vertical like our other wrinkles have been, but instead follows the curve of the leg as the skin is pulled over muscle mid-stride. As I'm sure you're used to at this point, Painting 1 is going to take a much simplified approach to these details. I am placing those dark shadows, but my brush doesn't have a lot of paint on it, so it drags across the paper, making an uneven wash. One thing I want you to watch for is how my sloppy wash on the body actually cuts into the shape of the tusk, making it much smaller than it should have been. Errors like this can be avoided if we are working carefully. Our final adjustments on Painting 1 are focused on adjusting values and reinforcing the overall forms. Using my soft brush, I can gently lay in these washes with minimal disruptions to the details below. The tusks are also in need of a bit of love, as I have largely been ignoring them up until now. I am placing some light washes to show the curvature, taking care not to disrupt the dark paint that is bordering the lighter shape. The final adjustments on Painting 2 look rather different, as I'm trying to fix earlier mistakes like softening off edges that have already dried. I do take a bit of time to add in some darker shadows that were needed for the overall contrast of this piece. Here is finished Painting 1. The piece uses the inaccurate line drawing, but I took care to treat the painting with as much respect as possible. Finished Painting 2 uses an accurate line drawing but rushes the painting technique. While some areas look okay, others are clearly not handled with care. And finally, I have a third painting to show you, this one using an accurate line drawing and painted with care. I didn't include footage of this one because the close shots would have looked very similar to Painting 1. When we look at them all side by side, we can see how important each skill is on its own and how they complement each other when used together. I hope that this video has helped you to identify which skills of your own may need some extra attention, but it's extremely important to note that you don't have to be good at both of these skills to create art. If you like to draw, of course, no one is forcing you to paint your sketches or drawings. However, it's really important to realize that the opposite is also true. If you love painting and don't want to or can't put the time into drawing due to life's circumstances, you shouldn't feel shamed into doing so. Copyright-free references exist so that you can reference or even trace them, saving you time to do what you love doing. As always, just make sure you have permission to use the photos that you're working from. I'd love to hear from you in the comments if any part of this video was particularly helpful, or if you have more tips for us that have helped you to hone either skill that we talked about today. If you want to know more, check out the Skillshare class for the whole scope of this topic, as well as that Mastering Water Control class that I mentioned earlier if you want to get a better grasp on painting with watercolors in general. There is a link for a free trial in the description. As always, thank you to my amazing patrons for your support, to everyone watching and engaging with this video, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, happy painting!